The year was 1857, and India was unsettled. The country had been ruled for about a century by the British, although not the British crown. The British Raj, as we know it, was yet to come into being. India was not really part of the British Empire yet. Rather, it was ruled by the British East India Company, a private corporation that functioned like a state. It had its own courts, laws, private armies, and, of course, colonies. By 1857, it had gradually transformed into being more like a nation-state than a business, but it was a distinct entity, separate from and not totally subordinate to the British government. 1857 was the centennial of the East India Company's rule in India, at least from the starting point they counted, their army's victory against the Nawab of Bengal in the Battle of Plassey in 1757, although the East India Company had already had a trading presence in India for almost 150 years before that, too. Among Indians, there was an atmosphere of millenarianism in the air. Clearly, the 100th year of the British occupation would be a change for the better. Something big was going to happen. It had to. They couldn't just go on like this. British people in India felt the same. Something big was going to happen, and nobody knew what. Already there were signs of discontent, especially after a decree handed down in the summer of 1856 that Indian people could now be drafted to fight in other British colonial conflicts. They'd been drafted into the East India Company's army for decades now, making up a fighting force known as sepoys, but only to defend India. The prospect of going abroad as cannon fodder for someone else's wars was new and terrifying, especially since some Hindu castes consider traveling across the ocean to be polluting and sinful. For the record, this is why, although Indian merchants have been a fixture in places like Africa and Indonesia for hundreds of years, they've always been disproportionately likely to be Sikh or Muslim. Early in the year, the East India Company began distributing a new model of rifle to the sepoys, a rifle with cartridges that consisted of a ball-shaped bullet and gunpowder wrapped in waxy paper. Soldiers were supposed to bite open the end containing gunpowder, sprinkle the powder down the barrel of their gun, then slide the end of the cartridge containing the bullet down the barrel with the paper still on. In order to make the cartridge slide down better, the outside of it was greased. On military bases across India, rumors began to spread that the grease on the cartridges came from beef fat, unacceptable to Hindus, or pork fat, unacceptable to Muslims. This probably wasn't true, although it's still disputed to this day. The fact that this rumor took off points to some understandable existing trust issues. The Indians whispered that Britain was trying to make them blaspheme their gods and turn them Christian. The British whispered that a mutiny was brewing. An ominous slogan began to appear chalked on walls across the country. Sublal ho gya hai. Everything has become red. And then, one day in February, a village chokidar, a word usually translated as watchman and effectively like a de facto small-town sheriff, was patrolling outside his little town in the north of India, not far from Agra, the city of the Taj Mahal. According to his testimony, a man came out of the woods and handed him 4 chapatis. Chapati simply means bread in Hindi. Naan is a type of chapati. On its own, chapati generally refers to a simple unleavened flatbread, closer to a tortilla than a fluffy slab of naan, mostly meant to soak up sauce and spices left over from a hearty meal. The chokidar looked over the chapatis. They were extremely normal chapatis. So, the chokidar was confused, obviously, but then he got even more confused. The chapati man said he, the chokidar, had to make 4 more chapatis and send them along to the chokidar of the next village over. This was apparently very important. So he went home. He built a fire, greased a pan, and cranked out 4 more chapatis. He walked to the next village. He presented the other chokidar with 4 chapatis, telling him to make 4 more and hand them over to the next village's chokidar. This was apparently very important. The other chokidar took the chapatis and thanked his neighbor, but he smelled a rat. He'd heard rumors of this. In other villages, mysterious men had popped up handing people chapatis and telling them to make more and pass it on. Something was happening. He couldn't fathom what, but when strange things happened in India and ordinary people were asked to do tasks they didn't really understand, there was only one culprit. The British, of course. He resolved to go to the nearest British magistrate and ask him point blank about the chapatis. And that's when things got truly weird. Oh, okay. I'm your host, Tor Parsons. These are my co-hosts, Jollibee the Durian, Sluzz the Shoggoth, Thimble the Doll, and Husalino the Capybara. And if you watch this video without going to torscabinet.com/STOR afterward and getting yourselves a phenomenal Jollibee mousepad, Thimble fighting mug, or t-shirt with all the curiosities, they will all come after you at once. And welcome to Tor's Cabinet of Curiosities. In Mathura, the nearest town big enough to have a British East India Company official overseeing things, Magistrate Mark Thornhill was presented with 4 chapatis and the Chowkidar's strange story. Thornhill examined them. Again, perfectly ordinary chapatis. The Chowkidar had seemed confident that Thornhill would know what the deal was with the chapatis. He did not. It may not have been the weirdest thing Thornhill had encountered in his years in India, not at first, but then he started asking around. Other magistrates in other places, tiny villages, bustling cities, had received chapatis, usually 4 to 6 of them, from Indian people, accompanied by questions along the lines of, "What are you people planning with these?" The Brits didn't have a clue. They didn't even eat chapatis. And yet, a network of chapatis was making its way across India, people handing each other chapatis from village to village at, frankly, alarming speeds. Thornhill's boss in Agra, George Harvey, estimated that the chapati wave was covering 100, even 200 miles a night, faster than the fastest British mail services. No message seemed to be carried along with the chapatis. Those delivering the chapatis said they were just following orders from the people who had given them the chapatis. When those people could be tracked down, they said they were just following orders from the people who had given them the chapatis. Indian people tended to assume it was a plot by the British. To do what? It wasn't clear. There was a cholera outbreak going on in the city of Indore, and some reported that the chapatis were spreading out from there, possibly to infect Indians. They did seem to be spreading northward from the center, but not necessarily from Indore. The most coherent theory about the British using the chapatis to destabilize India in some way was a variation on the greased cartridge rumor, or perhaps a precedent to it, since the Great Chapati Drive and the introduction of the new rifles began at right about the same time. This theory held that the chapatis had been cooked in beef or pork fat, or an even more devious way of making Indians defile themselves by touching them, they had been handled by untouchables. The Hindu caste system was a curious thing. There were a minority of cases where people of lower castes had more rights than people of higher ones. Of course, it wasn't fun to be a Dalit. In pre-colonial India, you had to be in a high caste to get any kind of high-status job, and people of lower castes were relegated to jobs like collecting trash, mucking out outhouses, and slaughtering animals, things that were seen as unclean. But because they were already considered unclean, things that would have polluted higher caste people were perfectly okay for the low castes. I've already said there was a religious prohibition on crossing the ocean among Hindus, but only the upper castes had to obey it. In some parts of the country, low-caste Hindus were even allowed to eat beef. And this made the British attempt to recruit Dalits to their side, with some success. Their lives weren't as bound by religious restrictions as other Hindus, which made them less annoying to employ. They could be offered lives abroad in other British colonies, and given how oppressed they were, in many places Dalits couldn't get within a set distance of a temple, for example. A lot of them saw Britain as a liberating force because they didn't like the high-caste Hindus either. In the Bombay province, today's Maharashtra, the British East India Company armies were 25% Dalits, 3 times their percentage of the population of the state. This made the rest of India distrust Dalits even more, and the idea that the British East India Company would make Dalits cook a vast amount of chapatis and send them out across India so devout Hindus would be sullied by Dalit cooked food, allowing them to be drafted to fight the Empire's wars because they were already polluted now, made a weird amount of sense. Except that this wasn't how the chapatis were made. As in the anecdote I told before, it usually wasn't, here, take this chapati and pass it on to the next village. It was, here, take this chapati, you can eat it if you want, and then make a bunch more chapatis yourself and send them along to this village, and this village. It was the same dynamic as a chain letter. Copy this letter and send it to 5 people you know, and something good will happen to you. Chain letters, which date back to the invention of postal services themselves and were commonplace online as well in the early days of email until I feel like they were sort of displaced as an art form by social media schizo-posting, typically aren't scams. There have been cases of people sending out chain letters that ask for money and end up as Ponzi schemes, but usually they were just a strange cultural phenomenon. Some of you may be too young to remember this. God knows who started each one and why, but sometimes you'd get letters in the mail, typically from a particular superstitious relative, that had some either creepy or mawkishly inspirational story, sometimes with a Christian or right-wing political message, although growing up in Oregon, I remember getting a fair few chain letters with a mawkish pro-environment fable as well. It would always end with an exhortation to copy and pass it on to a specific number of people, sometimes with a warning of bad luck and a story of someone who didn't pass it on and met a terrible fate. Looking it up, they seem to have been particularly pervasive in Japan. Here's an elite, older Gen Z, first got on the internet in the early 2010s memory. Who here listened to music on Pandora as kids? And for a while, if you looked at the comments to absolutely any song on Pandora, it would be something like 75% internet chain letters from lonely teenagers. The only place I've ever seen so infested by chain letter comment spam. It was always stuff like, you know that girl in school who's so beautiful, but you've never ticked up the courage to talk to her? Write her name on a piece of paper, tear it up, and then copy and paste this comment and leave it on 10 other songs on Pandora. If you don't, Jeff the Killer will Jeff the Kill your mom. If you do, your crush's name will appear in big letters across your screen, and she'll talk to you tomorrow morning. This is scary because it actually works. That's always how they ended. This is scary because it actually works. I was always too much of an annoying little Spock to fall for those, but I can't say I wasn't tempted. If minor bad things start happening from then on, it's hard not to think, maybe I've been cursed by reading this chain letter and not spamming it, right? Superstitions are normal. The exhortations to keep the wave of chapatis going often played on people's superstitions in the same way. People recalled hearing rumors that the chapatis would protect them from cholera going around, or put a curse on the British. That if you don't keep circulating the chapatis, your crops will be destroyed by hail. Both Brits and Indians who were concerned by the chapati drive tore apart the chapatis. They didn't seem to contain any kind of concealed message. Everyone who ate them said they tasted normal. There were no records of poisoned chapatis. At the same time all this speculation on the Indian side was going on, the British began to worry that the chapatis were something of a sleeper agent activation signal, that somehow, right under their noses, thousands of people across India had met and agreed on a plan for an uprising, and when people start sending out chapatis across the country, that's the signal to start fighting. Or start training or something, since no fighting seemed to accompany the chapati chains. Yet. Message or none, the sheer speed with which the chapatis moved was worrisome. If a peer-to-peer flatbread sharing network could outpace the East India Company's postal service, arguably the best logistics system in the world at the time, who knew how fast calls for an actual rebellion could spread? And soon, Britain knew. Within months of the chapatis first showing up on the scene, it seemed like the fears that they were a signal of trouble brewing were right on the money. On May 10th, at the major military base in the city of Meerut, hundreds of sepoys deserted their garrison and marched through the night to Delhi. There they roused the 81-year-old Emperor Bahadur Shah II, the last Mughal emperor, whose domain was exclusively over the old walled city of Delhi, and even there in practice was subordinate to the British. To the rebels, Bahadur Shah was to be the new emperor of a free India. Rioting broke out across Delhi in his support. Soon, at East India Company army bases across India, sepoys turned their guns against their superiors and joined the revolt. Delhi fell to the rebels within days. Neighboring states came under rebel control with frightening speed. Now, the East India Company, seeing their century-long rule dismantled before their eyes, called on the British Empire itself, again a separate entity at least in name, to help them. Britain diverted imperial troops that had been stationed in Europe. All summer, they laid siege to Delhi, finally breaking through in September after 3 months. It took another year to bring all of India back under British control. The 1857-58 Indian Rebellion is known by a variety of names. British historiography still calls it the Sepoy Mutiny, implying it was really just a minor disturbance that began and ended with some soldiers disobeying orders. India calls it the First War of Independence, although that's misleading too, because when India finally became independent in 1947, it was after decades of peaceful protest. There was never another Indian War of Independence. Unless you count World War II, because Britain really only let go of India because they could no longer afford the military force necessary to keep their colonies after the war, and because FDR made wartime aid to Europe conditional on the European powers giving more autonomy to their colonies. During the 1857-58 rebellion, some parts of India remained loyal to Britain and even raised their own armies against the rebels, using the broader conflict as a proxy for local, ethnic, economic, or religious conflicts, so it could almost be described as an Indian civil war as well. What is agreed upon is that it was the most important thing to happen in the 19th century in India. Nothing quite like this had happened against a colonial power before. There was the Haitian Slave Rebellion, but the French brought those people to Haiti. There was the American War of Independence, but that was a war against the new ideas of liberalism and democracy, espoused by people who were fundamentally British themselves, not a colonized people. Britain responded by tightening their screws. The East India Company was nationalized, and India was put under the direct rule of the Crown. This was the beginning of the British Raj, which would last until independence. The Brits designed everything from then on with the threat of an uprising in mind. The new train station in Lahore, now in Pakistan, but then one of the main cities of British India, was built with the fortifications of a medieval castle, so British troops could hole up in the station and fire on protesters if need be. And as soon as the dust settled, tribunals were set up to investigate just how the revolt began and how it could have been prevented. Number 1 on the agenda, what the hell was with all those chapatis? By then it seemed confirmed that they were some kind of signal after all, but try as they might, the British courts couldn't find a single Indian who wasn't genuinely puzzled. Is the sending of such articles about the country a custom among the Hindus or Mussulmans? And would the meaning be at once understood without any accompanying explanation? A British judge asked Jatmal, an Indian journalist, during the trial of Emperor Bahadur Shah. No, it is not by any means a custom. I am 50 years old and have never heard of such a thing before, said Mal. A general pardon had been handed down against all rebels who hadn't killed British people. Given how many people had rebelled, it would have been hard to restore order without keeping former rebels around, and far harder to piece together the origins of the rebellion. If the chapatis had carried some kind of message after all, people were encouraged to come forward and disclose it, with the promise that no harm would befall them. Nobody did. Nobody even tried to rat out anyone else for chapati-related schemes. The movements of chapatis had been well tracked in newspapers, and they didn't seem to match the spread of the rebellion. There was no pattern to where the chapatis ended up. Regions that stayed mostly loyal got the chapatis. Other places where rebellion burned hot weren't necessarily epicenters of chapati chains. Meerut, where the rebellion had started, was one of the last places reached by the waves of chapatis right before the sepoys began to mutiny, but in light of everything else, that seemed to be a coincidence. Furthermore, there were actually written pamphlets circulated calling for rebellion. Traveling puppeteers and performers had been sneaking pro-independence messages into their performances. The prospect was raised that the chapatis were a diversion, meant to provide a funny little mystery for the British to look into so that they wouldn't notice the real plotting going on right under their noses. But they still couldn't find anyone who claimed they'd been circulating the chapatis for any reason at all. Even the people who made and delivered the chapatis claimed that the only thing motivating them to keep the chain going were the vague threats of bad luck handed down by the people who had given them the chapatis, which they dutifully passed on along with the food itself. The ultimate conclusion reached by the authorities, and this remains the conclusion to this day, was that the chapati movement wasn't any kind of organized project and didn't carry any kind of message, but was something of a precedent to rebellion just as a sign of the tense atmosphere in India. The chapatis worked like chain letters: make some chapatis and pass them on. When times are tight and the public is restless, you get weird superstitions. Remember how in the weeks leading up to the 2016 election, America was gripped by a wave of creepy clown sightings? And a lot of them were caught on video, and sometimes people were caught and confessed to dressing up as clowns to freak people out. What was their stated motive? There was a wave of creepy clown sightings, and they wanted in on that. The real reason was America felt unsettled. We still don't know who the first person to make some chapatis and say, hey, pass these on was, or what was going through their head. But in normal times, if someone tells you that if you don't give these chapatis to 5 people you know, your crops will be killed in a hailstorm, you write them off as crazy. But when times are crazy, well, what harm can there be in making some chapatis? Whoever it was who started the chapati chain, soon they had no control over it. The chapati chain advanced from family to family, village to village, region to region, state to state, all for no real reason, a complete blank message. Nobody was in control of the chapatis. Nobody had the power to stop them, nor the power to single-handedly keep them going. The chapati movement was like a tire fire. You just have to wait for it to naturally stop burning. The movement of chapatis across the population became an entity unto itself, an example of emergent behavior. Roughly when a system becomes complex and self-sustaining enough that it starts to do things quote-unquote on its own. When we talk about systems with emergent behavior, we like to personify them. Evolution wants animals to be better at surviving and reproducing. It doesn't want things because it's not alive, but it's easier to think of it as being alive than being a self-sustaining system with clear goals and behavior that isn't. It's about as alive as the chapati movement was. The chapati movement wanted to make more chapatis. I bet there was emergent behavior in the chapati chain that worked exactly like natural selection in biology. Somewhere, someone tried a chapati curse that just didn't work. If you don't pass on these chapatis, you'll get beaten up by 2 really hot palace courtesans or something like that. And whoever received those chapatis looked at them and was like, better not make any chapatis then, and the chapati chain died in that village. But a few villages over, they were talking about some curse that really spooked people, and they were slinging out chapatis like nobody's business. The most commonly circulated curse, that your crops would be destroyed by hail, probably rose to the top without anyone consciously choosing it because it was believable and specific and out of people's control enough that it got people to keep the chapati chains going. I wish there was some sort of visualization of which villages got chapatis when, a down-to-the-hour map of the chapati movement spreading across India, forming patterns and eddies, getting stuck in some places, leaping far ahead in others. You know what that would look like? A cellular automaton. A cellular automaton is a pattern on a grid where you have a simple set of rules that leads to emergent behavior. The most famous is Conway's Game of Life, which consists of an infinite grid where squares can be either filled in, which is called being alive, or empty, which is called being dead. Every second, or however fast you're choosing to run the game, is a new generation. The rules are: a live cell that borders fewer than 2 other live cells dies. A live cell bordering 2 or 3 other live cells survives. A live cell bordering more than 3 other live cells dies. A dead cell bordering exactly 3 live cells comes alive. So, generation by generation, the pattern changes based on those rules. A simulation of Conway's Game of Life is an impressive thing to see because it looks alive. Sometimes you get repeating patterns, parts that just go back and forth, generation by generation. Sometimes you get objects that move across the grid as if under their own power, which are called spaceships. Some patterns never repeat, others repeat on a surprisingly long time scale after generations of changing shape. And nobody's controlling it. The patterns are just evolving based on the existing rules. If you managed to map the 1857 chapati movement, it would probably look something like this. And here's where I get thoroughly nerd-sniped. Some solitary genius could have used the chapati chains to turn all of India into a functioning computer. Here's how. So the main thing that baffled both Indians and Brits alike about the chapatis was that they carried no message whatsoever. It didn't seem possible to sneak a message into these chapatis, but you could have hidden a bit of a message in the chapatis. Just a bit. 1 bit of information. A 1 or a 0. Just burn the chapati on one side. Charred side up is 1, charred side down is 0. Now the chapatis are a binary code. On and off, this or that, oui or non. And as I showed in the Bell Labs video, once you've got your ones and zeros, you can do fucking anything. Suppose you present your village chokidar with 2 chapatis, each burnt only on one side. If you don't pass on these chapatis, you say, something terrible will happen. Here's how to avoid trouble. If both chapatis are burnt side up, you pass on a single chapati burnt side up. But if just one of the chapatis is burnt side down, then you pass on one chapati burnt side down. Same as if both of the chapatis are burnt side down. Only pass on a burnt side up chapati if both of them are burnt side up, otherwise always burnt side down. That's because you're a chokidar, you say. That's how chokidars are supposed to respond when they get a chapati. An and gate. Chokidars' wives do the opposite. Only pass on a burnt side down chapati if both of them are burnt side down, otherwise always burnt side up. An or gate. If you're a farmer though, well, farmers obviously do something else. If the 2 chapatis match, regardless of which side is up, you pass on a burnt side up chapati. If they don't match, you pass on a burnt side down chapati. An ex-nor gate. And remember to pass it on or you'll be cursed. You go from village to village, handing out chapatis and telling people this. They pass the information on. Everyone in India is now a logic gate, with their job and station in society determining how they function in this giant computer. Now, once you've got the chapatis going, you can start sending out more complicated instructions. If you get this pattern of chapatis, pass on the chapatis to a farmer. If you get this pattern, pass them on to a priest and a chokidar's wife. It would take a little time to fine-tune it, and realistically by then people would lose interest in passing mysterious flatbreads from person to person. Maybe tell people, this is what's going to defeat the British, just trust me, to keep it going. Either way, just by making a few chapatis a day, you have turned India into a massive Turing-complete computer, in which every single person is your transistor, your vacuum tube. A lot is unresolved here. Most importantly, how do you read the outputs? At what point do you get legible information from your nation-sized computer? Aren't people going to make mistakes that cascade down the command line? Yes, they will. I guess you build redundancy into your system by saying, send this to 5 different people, but quote-unquote programming them to do what they're supposed to do would take a lot of chapatis in a much more sophisticated code than we could expect random people to memorize for the hell of it. But wait, let's get back to cellular automata. We don't need to bother with all the complicated different functions. Hell, we don't even have to bother with burning one side of the chapatis. If our computer is based on cellular automata, our 1 and 0 can just be a chapati or not a chapati. That is the question. Tell people that every day they need to keep the chapati chain going. Just a little thing you gotta do in the morning, and if you follow along closely, somehow we'll defeat the British. Promise. Tell your neighbors, but don't let the East India Company hear. Every morning when you wake up, you take stock of whether your neighbors received chapatis yesterday or not. Each day is a generation of the cellular automaton. There are 8 different states, 8 different situations you can be in vis-a-vis your neighbors. Number 1, you, your neighbor to the left, and your neighbor to the right all received a chapati yesterday. If this is the case, you don't send along any chapatis. Number 2, you and your neighbor to the left got chapatis, but your neighbor to the right didn't. If this is the case, you make a chapati and send it to the specific person you've designated to be next in the chain. You can choose anyone when you start out, but it has to be the same person each time. Number 3, both your neighbors got chapatis, but you didn't. In this case, make a chapati and pass it on. Number 4, only your neighbor to the left got a chapati. Don't send anything. Number 5, you and your right-hand neighbor got a chapati. Send one along. Number 6, only you got a chapati. Send one along. Number 7, only your right-hand neighbor got a chapati. Send one along. Number 8, nobody got chapatis. Send nothing. That's a set of rules for a cellular automaton, like Conway's Game of Life, except your grid is India and your live squares are households with chapatis. Astoundingly, it's also a functioning Turing-complete computer. This particular cellular automaton is known as Wolfram Rule 110, and if you start out with the right inputs, that is, if you dole out chapatis to a few specific houses in a village such that you have the right I got one, this neighbor did, this neighbor didn't pattern, you can simulate what's called a cyclic tag system, and a cyclic tag system is Turing complete. If you want to read more about this, I have resources attached. Good luck, because I honestly don't understand some of this either. Rule 110 was only proven to be Turing complete in the 1970s, but long story short, now you can start working on a programming language where who gets chapatis each day and how that pattern tessellates across India can be used to calculate things. without requiring much thought from the individual chapati makers. They just have to ask their neighbors if they got a chapati, consult the rules, and get on with their day. What are you going to calculate? The world is your oyster. Probably the main way you'd use something like this to weaken British rule in India isn't directly through computing anything, it's simply by intimidating them by building something so novel and weird. Again, ultimately, I think this has too many instructions to get strangers to keep circulating the chapatis for no reason. But if somehow it worked, British India at the time had an estimated population of 200 million people. Suppose only half of them are actively participating in the chapati drive. Again, the real-life chapatis moved fast, covering hundreds of miles a day, even though everyone was just going through their daily lives, just taking a break to sling out a few chapatis in their spare time. Everyone in India would be part of this computer and not know it. Within a few weeks, you could get an actual result, if there was some way to read the results. ENIAC, the giant vacuum tube computer that was the state-of-the-art in the 1940s, could definitely perform operations faster, but it had just 18,000 vacuum tubes. What ENIAC lacked in speed, it would make up for in power. And you know who's smarter than me, and could have worked out the kinks and used chapatis to build a computer without electricity? 1,000 times more powerful than ENIAC long before ENIAC? If you're nerdy enough to watch this channel, you may have already predicted where I'm going with this. British India's own Glowfic protagonist, Srinivasa Ramanujan. One of the most influential mathematicians of all time, Ramanujan was born in 1887 in a small town in Tamil Nadu. His family was upper class, and contrary to the popular impression of him as completely self-taught, he did go to school, and he was able to buy and read books about cutting-edge mathematics, but the vast majority of Ramanujan's work was completely novel, with no outside input, independently discovering principles and theorems that had taken the rest of the math world centuries of work and dozens of previous geniuses to figure out. There has probably never been a greater mathematical mind in human history. But in our timeline, the British authorities recognized Ramanujan's intelligence, and he was brought to Cambridge, where he became sick and depressed, eventually dying at 32, possibly of tuberculosis. He may have heard of the chapati movement across India in his youth, although it happened 30 years before he was born. Given what Ramanujan came up with on his own, with minimal education, if he'd had another decade or so, he could easily have independently discovered the principles of computing our world credits to Alan Turing and Claude Shannon. The idea of Ramanujan as a managerial, high modernist champion of a free India, exploiting the worried, superstitious atmosphere in his country to secretly build the world's biggest yet and craziest computer, could only ever be a flight of fancy. This is sort of in the category of my old episode about giant squid becoming surface predators, where I'm taking real science and history and taking it in a speculative direction that's realistic, but sure is fun to speculate about, right? And hey, you learned interesting things about science and history along the way. But I discovered the story of the chapati movement by chance when I was doing research for my Jagannath episode a few weeks ago, and when I first decided to make an episode about it, I wasn't expecting this one to overtake Bell Labs as my most computer science heavy episode. I guess that too is emergent behavior. Sometimes a good story will nerd snipe me in a very particular way. Try making a supercomputer out of creepy clowns, America.
Believe in something right, but you do something wrong. A loaded question will break your bones. What puts you on your knees? You paint the walls in red, the color of your heart. But the man in gray will get you now. You've got to hide all day.